When the American Civil War ended in April of 1865 with the surrender of the Confederacy at Appomattox Courthouse, which we discussed last week, then the healing process needed to begin. So, one of the things that's really important to understand here, at least from the President Lincoln perspective, right? And remember, Lincoln is still the president when the Confederacy surrenders in early April of 1865. Lincoln's idea here for the surrender was that the Confederates were going to be brought back into the United States and no real punishment was going to be levied against them. So it was really much of his goal to try and reconcile the countries back together. Now it's important to also see here that there was no real punishment. When he was inaugurated in his second term in March of 1865, weeks before the surrender, right? Everybody knew the surrender was coming. So what Lincoln says in his second inaugural address, and I'm going to paraphrase here, it says something to the effect of, I want to bring back the country with generosity or charity towards all and malice towards none, right? He wants to bring back the United States to no punishment, right? We want to work together to bring the country back together. So, or bring the healing process. Obviously, his plan doesn't even get off the ground, right? Because the surrender is in April 9th of 1865, and he's assassinated on April 14th. So there's no real chance that he even gets the opportunity to do that. It's really left to his successor, Andrew Johnson. Now, Johnson is a really interesting president, right? He was not Lincoln's vice president in his first term, and he's only chosen for his second term. He's sort of late, right before the election, in the fall of 1864. Now, when he becomes the vice president, many people expect him to really push Lincoln to be very harsh to the Confederacy. Johnson was a anti-slavery Tennessee, I believe he was a senator before he was vice president. So many people anticipated, well, this guy's a Southerner and he doesn't like slavery. He's going to be really tough on them. So that's one of the reasons he was chosen as the vice president. And when he becomes the president, many people anticipate that that's going to happen, right? So let's talk about then the issues that emerge. So there's a couple of really big issues when the United States begins the Reconstruction process after the surrender of the Confederacy. Some of the major problems that we have are one sort of ill will, right? Even those Southerners, and there were many Southerners, roughly 50% of the Southerners, who did not want to rebel against the United States. But when they rebelled, and then sort of the next 4 years of the American Civil War led to a lot of bad feeling towards the people of the North and to the American government. And as a result of that, what you have is that you have a large portion of the Southern population, if not generally all of the Southern population, that feels that they can't really be reabsorbed into the American government. And as a result of that, you have a big problem of sort of a goodwill situation there. The other piece to this is the South has been utterly destroyed, right? In sort of a couple of ways, right? Number one, the South's major labor force, the slaves, have been taken away from them. Once they've surrendered, they have to accept the 13th Amendment. Slavery is now illegal. The labor force is gone. So for the South, there's that issue. Second, and in part of that, is the South is a major agricultural entity. Now that you've taken away that ability to make money in that process, what do you do with the South's economy? So you have to rebuild that. Other ways, 99% of the fighting has happened in the South, right? The only battle in the North was the Battle of Gettysburg. Otherwise, all of the fighting happens in the South. So you really have to rebuild the South, right? The South has been really destroyed. So that's another problem that you have here. And a part of, whether that's Sherman's march to the sea, where he has a scorched earth and just destroys so much territory, whatever the case may have been. So those are two big problems. The other big problem that you have, and maybe it's not terrible, maybe it's not a bad problem, but you now have millions of free African Americans who had never been free before. You need to they have no money because if they've been slaves for generations, they don't have any capital. Most of them don't have any education. So the few that do have very, very rudimentary education. So we're talking here really, really tough situation for the government. And then finally, who gets control over um, who gets control over Reconstruction? Is it the president? Is it Congress? Are it the states themselves? In whom do we put this power? The Constitution doesn't have that, right? The Constitution doesn't say when you rebel from the United States, these are the people who get to decide how you come back to the United States if you lose. That's wholly new for the United States. So the question, so why would it be the president? Well, if we say that this was a military endeavor, and we are now going to occupy it militarily, well, the president gets to do it because the president is the commander in chief. Okay, well, if it's a tax and a legislative thing, then it should be the Congress. Well, okay, if it's those two, but what happens if we're trying to breed goodwill? Well, then we have to go back to the Southern. So who gets control is a tough situation. One of the things that they do for the people who are newly freed is they have the Freedmen's Bureau. So this is founded really, really quickly, even before the war ends, right, March of 1863. And the purpose of this is to try and help people who have been newly freed get on their feet. So it sets up schools, it sets up funding agencies for helping newly freed African Americans who don't have any income or don't have a lot of money. It's just a brilliant program. But unfortunately, there's a lot of corruption that goes into it, and I'm not going to say that there doesn't, but there's also really good things that come out of it. And it's an interesting agency. It really supplies a lot of African Americans with a lot of great things: medical care, housing, education. But ultimately, it has to expire in 1872. It's just not. It's when Reconstruction sort of goes through its first phase of undoing. That's the first thing that goes. When the South has become sort of newly freed, there's a lot. Obviously, I think you can expect this. There's going to be a large portion of the southern population that is not going to welcome African Americans back, right? So what's going to happen is there's going to be new laws that are put into place called black codes that try and limit the rights of African Americans. Black codes come into effect not all at once, sort of piecemeal, as I say here, state by state. But what is important to see is that even though African Americans have become free at the end of the Civil War, the big impact that happens here is that sort of throughout that process, African Americans in the South continue to lose more and more rights. And in fact, one of the first things that happens, particularly after the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1867, is that you have a large portion of African Americans voting in the South. So you have the first class, if you will, of African American representatives coming into federal government in the House of Representatives, the first African American senator being elected in the late 1860s. However, once you start having the black codes being put in, and ultimately the Jim Crow laws, one of the things that continuously begins to happen is the reduction of African American rights. And in some states, particularly in the Deep South, like Alabama and Mississippi, there's not another African American representative into the House of Representatives or Senate for another nearly 100 years. It's actually pretty recently that Alabama, I believe it was in the mid 2010s, that Alabama had its first African American House of Representative member since the Civil War, so over nearly 150 years. So you can see that once the sort of initial phase happens, there's sort of a backlash immediately. And another big thing that happens here is called sharecropping. So as these slaves are gaining their freedom, one of the things that happens is they don't have the money to move. They don't have the money to leave the farms on which they have lived for generations. So what happens is they basically begin slavery by another name, which basically means that the slaves, the former slaves, now free people, are renting land or renting crops, small crofts areas from the people that used to hold them as slaves. They rent it back. They pay rent in the form of crops, hence sharecropping. But they're continuously in debt, right? Again, so this is basically just tying people to the land, forcing them to stay on the land. It's slavery by another name. So let's talk about the congressional the congressional legislative uh, reconstruction. So there's two groups that emerge within the Republican Party. The party that is basically directing um, Reconstruction. Remember, the Republicans are generally the party of the North. They have massive controls in the Congress. Now, it's important to know that it's not just all Republicans believe the South is bad, and all Republicans believe that they can agree on how to um, go about Reconstruction. There's two major groups within the Republicans, the moderates and the radicals. Now, the radicals had supported Andrew Johnson, largely because of what I said earlier, that Johnson was this Southerner who was anti-slavery. Many believed that he was going to be very hard on the South. So for the radicals, they believed that there needed to be massive punishments towards the South. They needed to basically militarily occupy them, control them, and really just make sure that they could not rise up. And they really wanted to push in federal power. The moderates, on the other hand, and this is the larger group of the Republican Party, they wanted to bring the South back in more peacefully, more immediately, and really just work on sort of reconciling the country. And in many ways, and again, we don't necessarily know what Lincoln would have been because he was assassinated so quickly, but by many pieces of positioning, many believe that Lincoln was going to be a moderate. The whole generosity towards or charity towards all and malice towards none. Anyway, Johnson becomes president after Lincoln's assassination, and once he becomes president, he works on the presidential reconstruction. He wants to direct how Reconstruction occurs, and his plan is to bring in, basically bring in a more peaceful, follow Lincoln's policy, and act as if they had to swear an allegiance, swear an oath of allegiance, but once they did so, and once they accepted the 13th Amendment, they could then be brought back into full citizenship. Radicals hated this idea because, again, they believed that Johnson was going to be super strict on the South, and they were appalled that he wasn't going to be. Reconstruction ultimately comes to an end. Reconstruction ultimately comes to an end with the election of 1878, where we're not going to cover this. This would be a topic for another course. But basically, in order to secure a Republican presidency, the Democrats throw their weight behind the Republican, and in order to solidify that, the Republicans have to agree that Reconstruction will come to an end. It comes to an end, and basically what happens is none of the goals that initially were set ultimately come into fruition. It is inconsistent. In some places it works, other places it doesn't. But basically, once you have this, you have that sort of swing back. Jim Crow laws come in, poll taxes, and the like. Thanks. Good luck.